Streaming.
Welcome to the Houston Public Schools Truth in Taxation Night. For those of you who are watching online, there is the PowerPoint that the camera cannot see, but you can access it at www.houston.k12.mn.us on the school board site within the school board packet for the December 6th board meeting. So what we're talking about now is the taxes payable in 2019. Okay. This is going to be a very brief overview, but as you look at the PowerPoint, as you're listening to this, it should go along quite quickly. The agenda is there for you to look at. We need to do this because the legislature in the state is responsible for setting taxes, but as a school we are responsible for setting within those parameters the taxes, the levies for the school.
Do that again.
Nope, just keep going. Next slide. The state sets the revenue, sets this tax policy, sets the maximum amounts a school can tax, and authorizes the schools to tax and request referendum. We have 5 funds. They are the general fund, which accounts for 98% of the revenue, the food service fund, the community service fund. The community service fund is community education, which is preschool, and then any of our adult classes. The construction fund is the 4th fund, and the debt service fund. The debt service fund is the fund from which we pay for the bonds. We have 2 bonds outstanding for our district, one for the HVAC system in the high school and one for the roof and HVAC system at the elementary school. Our 2018 budget, 2018-19 budget by fund, our beginning fund balance for all funds was $3,158,218, and the estimated fund balance at the end is $3,195,496. So there we've got an increase of about 40,000. The highlights on the next slide that shows the general fund budget highlights. The general fund, as I said before, is 98%. That's why you've got most of it as the gray part of the circle. On the next slide, you will see the general fund, where that general fund comes from. State aid is 90%. Property taxes are only 4% of what we get to run the school. Federal sources are 2%, and other is 4%. With that, regular instruction accounts for 66% of our overall budget. Special education instruction is 14%. The reason I'm highlighting that, most of our special ed requirements are mandated by the federal government, and as you remember on the previous slide, the federal government only accounts for 2% of this. So we have 14% of our budget with only 2% of the funding for it. So that's why we've got about 12% that has to come from the general fund to fund that. And that's when in the news you hear about cross subsidies for special education. It means that's the amount that's underfunded. So property tax background. The county assessor in the spring sets the market value for each parcel of property. You all received your market value slips in the spring, and you had until the beginning of June to go to the county if you felt that you were assessed a market value incorrectly. Then the legislature sets the formula for tax capacity. It's based on both the net tax capacity and the relative market value. So they're within the formula, two different computations that are used. The county auditor calculates the tax capacity for each parcel of property and the tax capacity for each school district based on the state formula. The legislator sets the formula. The state educational formula is also all of the other compensatory type formulas, so it's not just one formula that's used. It is actually about a 42-page document with multiple formulas. The Minnesota Department of Ed calculates the detailed levy limits for each school, and then the school board adopts a proposed levy in September. We have to do that before September 30th. However, by September 30th, the state usually doesn't have all their computations done. So what we do in September is try to reduce it to what we think we might need, but then add enough padding in to make sure that we're getting all the state aid we can. And then in December, we have the Truth in Taxation meeting, and on the December 20th meeting, that's when we reduce it down to just what we need to get by. Then the county auditor divides the final levy determined in the previous steps. So, how is the state doing on funding adequacy is the next slide. And with this chart, you'll see that from 2003 to 2019, the state share has really only gone up by less than $600. And the taxpayer share has gone up by almost $1,500 because the cost of living still is going up every year. And so the state's funding is not keeping up with the cost of living. That's what you need to see with that slide. So with this next slide, it states that for you. With the highlights, the state isn't keeping up with inflation. The state did give the school board the authority to levy up to $300 per pupil unit instead of going to the voter, and virtually every school in the state has done that. We also have local optional revenue, and we can levy up to $424 per pupil unit. However, what we typically do is figure out what just our resident pupil units would generate with our local optional funds, and we set the levy at that amount. With the next slide, you'll see the proposed levy payable 2018, and then you'll see what we actually did. So that first column of numbers is what came out in the September, or in the after the September meeting in 2017. And then you'll see the next line over is the actual levy payable in 2018. That's what we set at the December meeting. So you can see the movement that went on between September and December of 2017. Now, the next line over is the proposed levy payable 2019. That's what was set at our September meeting. And so then you can see the difference there. Next slide, please. So here are the possible scenarios for, once again, reducing that levy. The first column is what we actually received in levy in 2018. Now for payable 2019, if we kept our tax rate the same, so if you go down on the left-hand column to where it says property tax rate, that rate is the rate that's plugged into all of those multiple formulas to figure out what the taxes would be. Our tax rate that we approved last year was 0.566. Historically, in 2017 and 2016, we had the rate of 0.595. So we reduced it slightly last year. If looking at the second column of numbers over, if we kept that same tax rate, the taxes would not be impacted. However, the total levies that we needed would only be 50,000 less than what we are getting this year. So we would have to cut more than $50,000 next year to keep the budget in line, and that doesn't account for inflation or nor does it account for pay increases. So the next line over is making sure that we've got the same general education revenue coming in with taxes that we had this year and keeping that budget flat. And that would be an increase to 0.592, which would have an average impact of 4.6% increase on your taxes. For a house of $100,000, it would be about $26. That doesn't raise it back to the payable 17 rate. So the fourth line over is just rounding that up to about the rate we had the previous years prior to pay 18. And that would be a 5.3% change in property tax, or about $30 on a $100,000 home. The final column is looking at the cost of living increase, so that we would not only address the 50,000 deficit that a flat tax would give us, but would also address the fact that pay goes up every year and inflation goes up every year. But that would account for a property tax rate of 0.652 and would be about a 15.2% increase on property tax, or $86 on each home. At this point of the presentation, we would have public comment, but since no public is in attendance, I will say that the board had a conversation about this, and the board is looking at either the flat general education revenue, or a 4.6% increase, or looking at the 5.3% increase. So somewhere between $26 and $30 on a $100,000 home, and which would basically bring our tax rate back to what it had historically been the years preceding last year. At this point, we are concluding our Truth in Taxation hearing. Thank you very much.